Sitio Sabang in Barangay Cabayugan, a barangay 50 kilometers away from Puerto Princesa in the island of Palawan in the Philippines. A community that hosts the world-famous Puerto Princesa Underground River and draws over 350,000 tourists every year. Behind this laid-back, peaceful facade lay the fact that residents of Sabang, like many other off-grid villages in Palawan, have lived their lives without access to electricity. The community faced daily hardships. Public and private facilities, business transactions, and household activities were constrained. Evenings were spent with candlelights, and when the candle melted, the day was over.
Ang ilaw namin noong wala pang kuryente ay yung tingki may gas. Yung mga estudyante nag-aaral, hirap sila doon mag-aral sa gabi. Tapos kain, patayin ang ilaw, matulog, wala na.
Noon po kasi ilan-ilan lang yung may mga kuryente dito. Kung lumakad ka sa gitna ng kalsada, matatakot ka. Dahil madalang pa yung bahay. Lalo pag rubing ng mga tanon natin, talagang mahirap dahil madilim po yung lugar natin. Nandyan yung kanya-kanyang generator at yung makina, talagang maingay. At nakakasira rin sa kalikasan natin dahil ang pollution niya talagang mausok.
To serve this basic need of the community, Sabang Renewable Energy Corporation built its 2.4 megawatt hybrid power plant with 2.3 megawatt hours of battery storage and started supplying clean electricity to the residents.
Karamihan talaga ay depende doon sa household level yung maliit na mga portable generator set na kung saan ang pagtingin namin dito ay isang malaking threat sa environment. Doon nagsimula yung application ng Sabang Renewable Energy Corporation or SREC.
Puerto Princesa is one of the largest cities around the world, also one of the most diverse. It comprises a very vulnerable, very beautiful ecosystem. So when they identified the Sabang area or the Barangay Cabayugan area, which was still within the city limits, but not connected to the grid, and yet a lot of people were starting to invest in the area, we saw that as an opportunity for growth, but also an opportunity to make sure we put together a microgrid that will take care of the environment. We want to make a statement that this can be done in any remote area around the Philippines and the world.
As a bustling tourism destination, a steady supply of power in Sabang is also crucial for the continuous operations of tourist accommodation, food businesses, and other tourism enterprises.
The Luyon Beach and Mountain Resort is a 4-star property located in Puerto Princesa, Palawan, just beside the underground river. It's been in operation for 10 years already. The Luyon has been a pioneer in sustainability, so we are very happy that we are actually supplied by clean energy 24/7. It makes the guests more comfortable that they are not only traveling, they are doing sustainable tourism as well.
Noon, gumagastos kami ng 1,000 sa isang gabi sa generator. Ngayon, halos kalahati na lang yung nagagastos namin sa pagbayad ng bills namin. Malaking katipiran para sa amin.
Kami mga ordinaryong tao ay kailangan din namin ang kuryente. Paano rin namin mapaangat ang aming mga buhay kung hindi namin kailangan ng kuryente? Ay yun ay isang pangarap na namin. Pangarap ng mga investor na magkaroon po ng electrification project.
Mas magiging akma yung pagkakaroon ng ganitong source of electricity sa isang protected area, sa isang national park, at higit sa lahat, sa isang World Heritage Site.
Lahat ng tao talaga na magkaroon ng kuryente kasi malaking tulong pag may kuryente po, sir. Masaya. May kuryente na 24 hours na yung kuryente. Maraming salamat po kasi maraming taong pinasaya nila, sir.
We have nothing but gratitude in terms of the patience, the engagement, the learnings we've had together to really bring this world-class project together and make it work now for the people of Sabang. I think now we can use that experience and share that with other communities that have similar challenges, and we're looking forward to apply that, building on this landmark pioneer experience here in Sabang.
Human needs are innumerable, and electricity is just one of the most basic of them all. Electricity may be a common word we grow tired of hearing every day, but this means a lot to the people of Sitio Sabang. So the Sabang project isn't just about rural electrification. More than anything else, it is about giving hope, empowerment, and a brighter future for the community.
Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to our friends joining from other parts of the world. I am Joy Alampay, the Executive Director of Asia Society Philippines, and I'd like to welcome you all to Microgrids in Southeast Asia, our post-Earth Day 2021 conversation brought to you by Asia Society Philippines and We Energy Global, with the participation of Para Bukas and the Nanyang Technological University of Singapore. Climate change, a phenomenon and a threat that has continued to loom over the world, is a reminder to all of us to change our ways, be kinder to our planet, and in the face of calamities that shake our nations, a reason for us to act very fast. So tonight, we deep dive with experts on one promising solution: microgrids. What are microgrids and what does this green technology really mean for Southeast Asia? Is this the answer to the region's energy needs? And is this the answer to ASEAN's Community Vision 2025? For a regional focus on environmental protection for now and the future? So together, let us find out tonight. Feel free to put in your comments and questions during the discussion. And with that, please help me welcome our host for tonight, a woman who wears many hats. She's an educator, a broadcaster, entrepreneur, a lawyer, and an environmentalist. Please help me welcome Attorney Aina Magpale. Aina?
Hi, Joy. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. But for now, I will just have one hat, and that is for microgrids. And good evening. Actually, good evening for those who are watching us right now in our region, but also good morning and good afternoon to wherever you might be joining us in this conversation on microgrids, where we focus on our region, Southeast Asia. And as Joy already said before, we get to ask the more difficult questions. And thankfully, it has nothing to do with COVID 19, which is a welcome change in the past year that we have been battling with this pandemic, but certainly no less important for us to be able to find the answers. And so for this evening, we have with us a very knowledgeable, and I would say an expert actually, who will be giving us a presentation on microgrids. And he is no stranger to microgrids because, for what it's worth, let me just share with you that Quintin has been instrumental and is actually part of the very first microgrid implemented system, hybrid implemented system in the Philippines through their Sabang project. So, Quintin Jose V. Pastrana will be with us right now to share with us his presentation. But before that, let me just give you a few facts about Quintin. He is the head of business development of Winergy Global and is president of Winergy Power Pilipinas. Quintin also serves as the chairman of Winergy Global's affiliates. He completed his master's business degrees in business, international relations, and literature from the universities of Georgetown, Cambridge, and Oxford. But ladies and gentlemen, don't let that fool you because there is in Quintin the passion for the art of poetry. He has championed an entrepreneurial focus on renewable energy, off-grid solutions, education, community empowerment, and sustainable development. He served as anchor also and producer of ANC and Bloomberg Philippines. He was awarded as a U.S. ASEAN Business Council Rising Star in 2010, which just goes to show that he is not that young anymore because that was more than 11 years ago, for contributing to a stronger regional business environment. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Quintin Jose Pastrana.
Attorney Aina, thank you very much for that colorful and kind introduction. Without giving away and spoiling the entire presentation, I will end with this first note, which is, if it wasn't for technocrats and leaders in the public and private sector like Attorney Aina Agpale, I think you would have less of these fewer of these investments and less flourishing. In fact, that's really the main theme of my presentation, which is how to create an enabling environment so that the energy of the private sector, the public sector, the civic sector, and the communities themselves can really make the impact at the last mile delivery area. That's really what it's all about. And I'm really excited to share the presentation with you. But thank you for the introduction, Tori Aina, and I look forward to our dialogue and our panel.
Okay. So with that, I think Quintin will be ready to make his presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Tori Aina. I'll do this for around 10 to 12 minutes, try to be as efficient as possible. Let me share the screen. All right, I'll put this on describe. Great. I assume everybody has seen the screen. Let me just begin by talking about a book that was, and I'm dating myself because this is an old book called The Global Paradox by John Naisbitt. And no matter how old it is, it has a timeless truth to it. And it means, and without getting you through the 350 pages, his thesis is the more powerful and robust the world economy is, the global economy, the smallest players must be the most empowered ones. And that really is a theme that resonates throughout my life in terms of trying to help, the smallest units of society, the most basic units, because that's the only way you're going to build a society. So expect that theme to come out bit by bit and all throughout the presentation, especially as it relates to these last mile delivery solutions. Now, when you talk about last mile delivery solutions and going to Joy's question, is this a solution for Southeast Asia? The answer there is absolutely. Not to take up from one of our beauty beauty queens and Miss Universe contestants. How many islands are there in the Philippines? Yeah, well, it's basically just under half what it is in Indonesia. And then how many mountain ranges and deltas and river systems are there in Central Southeast Asia, with the landlocked that comprises Myanmar, Thailand, the Mekong Delta with Laos and Cambodia. I mean, just hundreds and hundreds. And you look at these geographical formations, and that is both part of the reason we have such a beautiful region, but also a challenging region in terms of the kind of equitable development that you want to see. Because literally the distance between the city centers and the most remote areas is quite challenging, and therefore it presents a challenge in terms of inclusive development, getting everything from food to roads to infrastructure and electricity and development across the region. In fact, when you look at these three countries, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Myanmar, it forms the bulk of what we see as a business case as a company. But from a development perspective, this is where you see the pain points, that over 120 million people in Southeast Asia still do not have access to clean, reliable, 24/7 and affordable electricity. 10 million people in the Philippines, despite noble efforts in the government, it's just a lot of people, 110 million people spread across 7,100 or now 7,400 islands, depending who you talk to. Indonesia, basically, you're looking at over 14,000 with about 1,000 sites that still don't have access to power. And then Myanmar, where you have the deltas and the mountains and the fields and with the current political challenges and economic challenges, you have 40 million people. So roughly the 90 million people is really the sweet spot when it comes to the opportunities to solve these pain points. And that's where we as a company have come in and said, this is where we want to make our mark. Now, just to give you an idea of what a microgrid is, a microgrid basically is a standalone in situ, as they call that, a entity that supplies its own power. And because it's so self-sufficient, it's not dependent on the core. If you look at, for example, the long political debate in the Philippines, why is Imperial Manila always getting the main spoils, and why can't it be Batanes or let's say Dumaguete? Why can't there be more spread development? That's because a lot of the main developments really come out from the cities naturally. That's the market force. But then people are left behind, especially when it comes to development in remote areas. So the solution there, especially as technology has gotten better, is to equip these areas to have their own power, their own water, to be self-sufficient in terms of food security, and therefore they can stand on their own and they can generate the kind of economic power that will draw the populace there. So you don't have an overcrowded Manila, you basically have, or Jakarta or Yangon, for example, and now you can have these nice decentralized zones of empowerment. And you can see that already with the great work of the Philippine Economic Zone Authority, where hundreds of economic zones are being done outside Manila, and they're creating locators and communities. Effectively, what we're looking at is a standalone grid, ideally 24/7, using a number of energy sources. We have to be agnostic about the kind of ecumenical, to use a Catholic term, in terms of the sources of power we use, just so as long as we have a low cost, highly reliable energy source and even utilities, so that the grid can stand alone, investors can come, and you can create life out of what would be raw land, effectively. And then you can even export to other communities that need it. That is really the decentralized growth model here. The benefits are quite immense. There's a multiplier effect out there. Friends of the World Bank, I took this from their presentation, so it's part of the resolution. But you talk about health benefits, clinics and hospitals moving there, vaccination, which is important, having cold storage, local employment, multiplier economic benefits, SMEs coming in because there's Wi-Fi and they can actually, sell more products. They can actually, more trade can come in, more farm to market roads can be built because there's an energy source there. Prices go down at least by half, so that it encourages people to invest in appliances at the household level, cold storage at the village level, and even more economically multiplying activities. Of course, if you're using renewables, which can be done in the local area, that becomes a big boost. Reduce greenhouse gas emissions, energy security, which is basically you don't have to worry about the big power plant in Luzon, for example, or in Java, or the mainland or out of Yangon, these grids stand up on their own. And all in all, it really belongs to empowering a community. And like in the Philippines, there are 1,500 municipalities, 40,000 barangays. Imagine a microgrid there where it doesn't make sense for the big grids to supply. You actually have them all stand alone, and they're competing economically and inclusively. Effectively, what you would need then is, a consortium to do it. So this is where I just want to give our nagbubuhat ng sariling bangko, to use a Tagalog term, or let me just talk about our credibility, so at least you know that when I talk, I'm not just talking from thin air or hot air. So basically, We Energy Global and Clean Grid Partners, which is a joint venture with great Japanese firms and global firms, TEPCO Power Grid, they're Tokyo Electric Power, which has a grid company, Chubo Electric, which is one of the leading conglomerates in Japan, and ICMG, which I say is like the McKinsey of Japan, a great consulting firm. So we've put together this joint venture to help make sure that we put our money where our mouths are, to make sure we invest in these microgrids, because they do have investment risk and long-term runways. They're not quick in, quick out exit projects to use renewable and hybrid assets. We really want to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. The direct ones, obviously, we talked about the ones that were on the multiplier effect, but the direct ones is the access to electricity and contribute to climate action. So 7 and 13. To really reconstruct local economies. This is really where the last mile delivery empowerment comes in, especially with the risk of the post-COVID era. We're not even in the post-COVID era yet. We're in the thick of it, and yet the development opportunities are immense. At the end of the day, it's applying technology, finance, and partnerships to really empower communities. And the idea now is, in a global world, just like the John Naisbitt mantra, we're trying to get capital from the largest and most developed parts of the world, like, for example, Europe, and where the investment returns are higher is in growth areas like Southeast Asia. And that's really where we are in terms of channeling capital technology there. So that's a bit of advertisement for our firm. Now I can talk about things in terms of what we can do. Bottom line, for a company who wants to get into microgrids, you're going to have a soup to nuts approach. A microgrid is everything from generating power to putting it in the household. So you really have to have at least 5 to 6 functions, which is you need to have strong project management. You need to have great engineering design and logistics, which is basically getting equipment around the world to a small island, let's say in Palawan, or let's say in the Flores Islands in Indonesia. You're talking about good construction management and research and development. What's great about that is you leverage resources across the region. You talk to contractors, partners, suppliers. So you really have that in itself, building a microgrid takes a village, so to speak, of suppliers and scientists, engineers, and business development. So really, it is a really great approach in terms of teamwork and generating economic growth alone in an industry. Now, to the microgrid itself. The microgrid really is, if you were in the Philippines, you'd basically say you're a combination of National Power Corporation, or a generator, and National Transmission Company, which is the transmission line, and Meralco, or electric cooperative, that distributes to the households. That's the challenge of this 3-layered approach. You're looking at generation, transmission, and power management system, and the distribution part. So that's the exciting part. And where the exciting part is actually in the middle. The middle is where the power comes together, blended with state-of-the-art technology. And this is where either you combine renewables with a conventional source, or you even include a battery, because battery costs are going down. And in 3 years, they could go down to less than half of what they are right now, depending on innovation. So you're looking at a lot of this cutting-edge technology that's bringing down power costs, increasing reliability, and bringing power to the household where there was none. In reality, if we did the calculations, and this is a graph that we showed when we testified in the Philippine Senate, that the great thing about hybrid things, if you combine energy sources, you're actually saving more money, and the government does not need subsidies. Why is this important? Because if you're going to go to a remote area, subsidies are important, because to build an entire grid with the lines, let's say 20 kilometers of lines, a power plant, getting right of way, and only for a small population, this economies of scale is pretty apparent. But if you use good technology and good engineering and good project execution, you actually lessen the need for subsidies. And that is the case when we showed that if you combine energy sources, you would be much cheaper than if you relied on a pure renewable or a pure conventional. And that's really what the science is telling us now, especially since microgrids are meant to last between 20 to 25 years and beyond, because that's how long typically a solar panel will last, how the inverters and the batteries are increasingly going to last. And that's really where the economic and the magic is. Lastly, I want to mention to you, because there are a lot of people here who still identify themselves as bona fide tree huggers, and that's fine. But the reality is that you're going to have to start with a hybrid system as the rest of renewables go down in price. So at the end of the day, for example, battery costs are going to stay stable over years, but at the end of the day, they could go down. Solar itself can increase in generation because you can actually add more solar panels. And then other sources like wind, tidal, which depend on where the area is. If you're near the coastal area or the mountains, there should be some wind with the wind map. And at the end of the day, if it's rough and the coasts are not so benign as we tested in some areas of the Philippines, you actually will have good tidal power potential. But if you combine these all together, that's great. Having said that, right now, diesel still plays a role in terms of stability. If the battery doesn't soak up all the power, and let's say the economy goes back in a certain area, you will have to need more electricity, and therefore a backup power like diesel will work. Having said that, though, the brilliant engineers that we work with actually have thought about, and our CEO has thought about, hey, listen, in the future, couldn't we use machines that not only use diesel, but biodiesel, where you could use actually biofuels that are non-food security impactful. So at the end of the day, you could see on the right side that eventually that grid could be purely clean. And that is what a microgrid is. It's a good way of evolving energy sources while putting immediate needs of the community first. And that is a great evolution. Now, the last thing I was going to mention to you before I get into some of the examples is our next step, which is basically in light of this, like them or hate them, you've got to admit, food security is paramount, because if you see these community pantries sprouting all over the Philippines and in Southeast Asia, you're looking at the need for food. That is the first, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy, that's the first thing. And guess what? It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive to a microgrid. You could supply power and you could supply vegetables that can help make the community healthy. In Palawan, for example, where we're at, it's not necessarily an agricultural area. In fact, because of the kind of topography and soil health there, a lot of the vegetables still come in from Manila. So you can imagine the cost. And from Manila, they come from places like Mangkayan, where I used to work up in the Cordilleras. So that supply chain itself, if it's disrupted, in the same way you do things with microgrids, you want to have something locally. So our plan, in compliance with the Department of Agriculture, Agrarian Reform, and the local city government that has kept the agricultural component intact, we are planning to put an agrivoltaics plant underneath the solar panels. So we will be growing anything from ampalaya to chili to lettuce and all that, and even palm and banana trees on the perimeter. So that is an experiment that microgrids can do, and we're looking forward to doing that all over. So let me close by talking about some examples. The bottom line for us is, with opportunities microgrids, you can do so many things. You can put in blockchain, you can monitor remotely, as we're doing now. You can actually sell the power and have them be used for ratings agencies to improve the debt profile of a local government. And at the end of the day, this makes the community resilient. And resilience is the name of the game in a climate adaptive and climate risk and economic pandemic risk world. So if you think about it, I'm not talking about theory. This is an actual grid in Palawan. This is a 2.5 megawatt peak hour and 2.3 megawatt hour battery system that is there to supply the village that is housing the World Heritage Site called the Palawan Underground River. So instead of getting a coal plant in the area, we put in a microgrid by combining 5,500 panels with 2.3 megawatts of Tesla batteries, which is housed in that second house when you see on the left. And we have biodiesel generators that actually provide 24/7 to over 550 households, 2 hotels, and pretty soon, growing number of tourists. We are planning 21 sites around the Philippines, possibly 13 new microgrids. Now the government is bidding these out, and we're happy to participate along with all the other microgrid players. And Myanmar, barring any, depending on the political situation there, there's so many opportunities in these riverine systems, these riparian systems, where like the Irrawaddy Delta and all that, where people are harvesting fish but have no power. So you can imagine what you can do with the economy there. Indonesia is the same thing, much larger area, but similar microgrids in areas and townships where now Indonesia is not starting to reduce subsidies on diesel. They used to be a diesel and fossil fuel exporter. Now they're neutral to net importer, so they need to do renewables. And now we're helping them provide that in their remote locations. So the final thing I was going to mention, as I mentioned earlier, is you really need an enabling environment. You need great technocrats like Attorney Aina and the rest of the Department of Energy staff and the Energy Regulatory Commission and all the interagency collaboration to make the procedures a lot more investor friendly, that are level playing field, because there's a lot of bidding and procurement going on. That allows investors to come in, and it brings in the financing institutions like DBP, like the World Bank, like all the commercial banks that are putting their money in there. And now it allows the innovation to grow and putting things together. And like I said, there's a lot of checklists here you see. But what it all means is this. This is my final slide. This is about going to an island like we're seeing here off the West Philippine Sea, doing a PowerPoint on a tarpaulin with hundreds of people in the communities, telling them that they don't have to pay 50 pesos per kilowatt hour, which is really murderous, but they have no choice because there's no electricity, and to tell them they can pay close to what people pay on the mainland so that they can live their lives in peace and progress, and more importantly, be as productive citizens as they can as Southeast Asia emerges as a superpower in the world. So with that, thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer the questions and forge a dialogue during the panel. Maraming salamat po.
Okay, thank you very much, Quintin. I can just imagine how difficult it must have been to put into a 15 or 20-minute presentation everything that you would have wanted to say about microgrids, especially on your experience already in Sabang. But I can see that we have a lot of takeaways already and highlights that we can uh, pick up from in order to discuss this more in depth. And to do that, we have with us two experts and professionals in their respective fields who will join us in the panel of reactors. First, ladies first, we have Attorney Josine Alexandra Gamboa, an environmental and energy lawyer and a public policy specialist, and a law professor at that. She earned her Juris Doctor from the UP College of Law, which shows that she is quite young, because when I graduated from the College of Law, there was no JD yet. It was just a regular LLB. She got her master's in law from the University of California, Berkeley, where she has certificates of specialization in environment and energy law and in public policy law. Currently, she is a partner in YDL Law as well as a fellow of Para Bukas and part of the Board of Trustees of the Philippine Reef and Rainforest Conservation Foundation. Hello, Alex. Good evening.
Good evening, Attorney Aina. Hello, Quintin. Such a and I echo what Attorney Aina said. Parang it was such a challenge for you to compress that in 12 to 15 minutes. But I'm so glad that even in such a short time, we could just see the breadth and the depth of your work. And I'm always I'm a policy person, but I'm always so amazed by project implementers and how hard the work is. So thank you for sharing your work with us.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Alex.
And also, we have with us Dr. Nin Huntong. Dr. Nin Huntong has 20 years of track record in growing the R&D innovation ecosystem in Singapore's energy and infocom sectors. His experience ranges from technology, strategic planning, conceptualization, and delivery of R&D and test bedding programs in emerging growth areas, and forging strategic partnerships with multinational corporations, local enterprises, as well as economic agencies to commercialize R&D efforts. So he is our techie in this group. Dr. Huntong, good evening.
Thanks, Aina, and thanks, Quintin. It was a fantastic presentation. Gave a very good overview of microgrids, its benefits, and what to look out for. Very honored to be invited to this panel, and hope to be able to contribute. Yeah.
So maybe we can start off by asking our panel of reactors for their inputs or insights along the lines of the question: are the archipelagic countries actually ready for microgrids in terms of implementation and just basically the concept of microgrids? Do you think that there is sufficient policy and even a regulatory framework in order for these different models to work in archipelagic countries? What do you think of that? Alex, maybe?
Thank you, Attorney Aina. So for the Philippines, in particular, there have been a lot of moves to do both things, to intensify electrification in remote areas, as well as to include renewable energy in the energy mix of the whole country, not both for cities and off-grid areas. Um, However, we really have been seeing in the policies in the Philippines that renewable energy one is still a preferential technology right now, but there's no really clear metrics or number wherein we're supposed to actually apply renewable energy in off-grid areas. So that's one of the policy gaps that we have been seeing. Of course, another policy gap that we've been seeing is just in general in terms of renewable energy being implemented in the Philippines. There is still there was a boom in 2015. We saw it in the Philippines where we issued a policy for a feed-in tariff for renewable energy. However, since then there had been a policy gap. And recently, the DOE in 2019 did say that they were going to auction off more energy, renewable energy in the Philippines. However, there really haven't been guidelines since 2019 to really send a signal to investors that we were moving towards that direction. So although the Philippines has enacted like laws like the renewable energy law that is some sort of signal that we're moving to decarbonization, there still needs to be a lot of details to be filled, and also a lot of things to work on in terms of the ease of doing business in the Philippines, in particular in this area of renewable energy and electrifying off-grid areas.
Dr. Huntong, do you think that technology actually has become a barrier in this case, where developing countries are unable to catch up or to cope with the emerging technologies in order to integrate this in their system?
I think the technology has matured quite significantly. So solar prices, for example, has dropped very significantly, even to the extent, for example, take the example of Singapore, whereby 90% of our electricity is generated using natural gas, so what we call a CCGT gas turbine. So that is the cleanest form of fossil fuel, and it is also fairly cheap. When compared to deploying solar in Singapore, because Singapore is a very a lot of high-rise buildings, so it's actually a lot more costly in terms of deploying solar because you actually need to go up to the rooftop. There's additional engineering costs. But even with that, prices of solar deployment in Singapore has achieved what we call price parity, meaning that it is comparable or even cheaper than your typical CCGT-based gas turbine-produced electricity. Of course, then the next question comes in, which is, what about adding energy storage? Because solar is always intermittent, right? With cloud cover, so on and so forth. That impacts grid stability. And beyond a certain point, actually, that may result in blackouts. So when you add in energy storage, that becomes the so-called the tipping point, right? Because storage is still expensive, and you need to actually find different ways of monetizing energy storage. For Singapore, I think there are two ways. One is actually more coming from participation in what we call frequency regulation market. So frequency regulation market is actually a smaller time scale electricity market to mitigate fluctuations in the grid. In countries like, for example, California, even in Germany, that is one form of revenue whereby energy storage players are using to actually make additional revenue from energy storage. The other is more a cost-cutting measure whereby energy storage is used to shave off the peak load, and with that you can actually pay less in terms of contracted capacity. Maybe let me explain a bit, because in Singapore, you need to pay a certain fee to the grid operator, which is Singapore Power, tied to the maximum load that you expect to consume. If you actually consume more, there's actually a penalty, meaning that you have to pay additional amount. So it is important for any consumer of electricity in Singapore to size up that number correctly. Of course, if your peak load is infrequent, then it makes sense to have energy storage to actually reduce your peak load. And because of that, you actually reduce the contracted capacity fee that you need to pay Singapore Power. So that becomes a cost savings element. So with these two elements, we are seeing that even with storage, we are expecting that to be, I would say, economic viable in terms of deploying that in Singapore. Yeah.
Dr. Untong, I think this is where economies of scale would really play an important role. And I think, well, maybe Quintin can shed more light on this, because that's well and good in an on-grid landscape where there can actually be a market for the renewable energy to be able to allow its investors to earn off whatever is in excess, or shall we say, to have a renewable market. But for off-grid areas, it's quite difficult to put in place a power management system that will have to balance the cost of the renewable energy together with the conventional energy, so that the consumer is not too burdened with the cost. Quintin, what has your experience been on this? And I saw you did have a slide where you showed that over a 20-year period, it would in the long run show that it's more cost effective. Maybe you can shed more light on this.
Thanks, Attorney Aina, and Dr. Huntong, thank you for your point as well. I really believe that it's not a one size fits all. So the chart that Attorney Aina mentioned, really just a testament to the benefits of hybridization. So you have to have a contingency curated type approach in terms of looking at the kind of power. So for CCGT, for example, I understand I came from the oil and gas industry. That's how Attorney Aina and I know each other, because I was in a larger corporation doing both geothermal and natural gas. And for mainstream base load power, that even peaking power on a main grid, that really helps. Or in, for example, a mature market where there's a contiguous landmass, it makes a big difference. I just share a story about, I was on a stage in an energy forum with one person who was just very, very adamant about the beauty of nuclear power. Obviously, that's a controversial topic, and the only answer I had, because I said, look, we're not competing with each other. If you can, the economies of scale of a nuclear plant, you have to have at least 100 megawatts to be able to generate the kind of returns you have. You can't put that in a
maybe.
Yeah, you can't even put that in an or in the Philippines, it was a 600 megawatt, right? Westinghouse plant. You can't put that in a small fishing island off the coast of Busuanga where we're building a power grid, right? So, and you cannot put it there and then pipe it out to Palawan as well. That doesn't make sense. So at the end of the day, the context there is the archipelagic nature will force people to start thinking, okay, on the last mile delivery solution beyond the main grid, what is the optimal combination, and what are the factors in the area that led to that? Let's say, I'll give an example now. Palawan, for example, we did a study with university in the Netherlands, because our provenance of the company is Dutch. We had researchers come there, and we realized the reason why Palawan is such a beautiful place and great to chill out, as opposed to, like, say, a place like Siargao, who people know that as well, or like Bali versus a surfing area, is the waves are been very benign in Palawan. So at the end of the day, what it really meant is we wanted to put tidal power there, but we can't because the area is just too benign. The volumes in terms of the flow are not going to be enough to power a micro turbine, which is available now. Having said that, if we had a project somewhere on the other side near Isabela or near Quezon, that would be ideal if we tested it. So at the end of the day, if you look at the Palawan side, you're looking at, as some of our grids are like, you're looking at solar, which is very, very stable, and then you're looking at storage, as Dr. Huntong mentioned, and then the third part could be tidal, could be wind, could be biodiesel. So at the end of the day, it's what is the combination that brings the cost low, and then there are trade-offs, right? The Philippine government was very, prescient and smart enough to say, you know what, if you're going to get a license to do a qualified third-party program, which our company is involved in, you're going to have to make sure in this area you have to do it 24/7. So the trade-off there is we can get the lowest power, which is solar, but because it only goes for 8 to 10 hours a day, you have to complement it with something, which is storage, and then the butal or the gap should be done. So that's a nice problem-solving thing for engineers and scientists and CFOs to work on. So the long and short answer is it's going to be a trade-off between the technology that brings you the cleanest and at the same time the financing that gives you the most affordable. And then of course the subsidy regime comes in if there is one. And when you blend it, you go to the Energy Regulatory Commission, of which you were a commissioner, and then you make the hearings and say, does this pass? And this is advantageous to the community, which is paying twice the price. So then you make the case. So the business case has to be a policy case and a community case. And if you check off those three boxes, the technology will work.
I think we need to get into the what do you call it? We need to dive into the processes also because you've started it already, Quintin. But before the processes, actually, there's a question that we have here. What are the microgrid implementation challenges that you have so far been able to see, actually hurdle, and are still battling?
Yeah, thanks, Katarina. And you see part of some of our challenges as well. But like I said, these challenges are opportunities where we always see the glass half full and can be expanded, right? So at the end of the day, it is about the policy infrastructure in the area. So at the end of the day, the market is obviously a great thing. If you have people who don't have a lot of electricity, you see that, wow, that's a pain point I want to help solve. And that already makes it robust. But the other part of the equation is the policy structure able to allow you to make a 20-year investment without somebody abrogate, and I'm using a legal term here, and I'm not a lawyer, without abrogating a contract, because you have to get your return after this period of time because it's a long runway. So if the policy infrastructure is continuous, that goes beyond several presidential administrations, for example, the Philippines, then that gives your investors a confidence to do it. And then the third one is really more in terms of community acceptance. Is your community going to say, hey, listen, we have indigenous people here. You have to go through a free and prior informed consent, which we have to do in one of the islands. So if you're able to map the community, the policy, and then the market risk well together, it's always going to be net positive. But it takes some time. The first microgrid we had, because we didn't take any shortcuts, we went, everything was above board. We didn't have any politician relatives. We did it straight up. It was 7 years before we built our first microgrid. Now, thankfully, because we know the system is improving as we speak. We have great people in the government who are working through the bureaucracy. That's cut down the process quite significantly. So again, it's a trade-off with policy, market, and technology and community.
Attorney Alex, do you think there are enough incentives for the private sector to actually be able to consider this as a viable investment?
In terms of what Quentin was mentioning, that you do need to increase investor confidence in the Philippines through these long-term policies. Currently, when you look at the Philippine Development Plan, which is the midterm to long-term development plan of the Philippines, there's not much going on there to really support off-grid areas. However, if you frame the discussion in order to say that in the Philippine Development Plan, we actually have been talking about inclusive development. And when you talk about inclusive development, you then see that we actually have an energy reform agenda and a new electrification target of electrifying the Philippines for around 90 to 95%. And the only way you can do that, because the Philippines is an archipelago, is to create these microgrids, because there's no way that you can electrify all most or if all the islands of the Philippines, and that you can say that electricity prices are still affordable. So because necessarily, if there's this thing that they call the universal charge for missionary electrification, where what people don't realize is the more that we put diesel in these off-grid islands that provide electricity to these off-grid areas, that comes back to us. The cost of producing electricity for a higher price because of these diesel generators are passed on to consumers on grid for because of that universal electrification charge. So taking all these things, the private sector should already know that this will be the only way for the Philippines to achieve the rate of electrification that the government has set as a target, to still ensure energy security and to provide energy access to the population, where you can still say that, as sabi nga ni Quentin kanina, a 50 peso electricity charge is murder. So if the Philippines has set this electrification target this high, and considering that our nature is an archipelago, off-grids are the only way to go. So knowing that, the private sector should be able to have confidence in getting into this type of industry.
Thanks, Attorney. Attorney Aina, if I could just interject before Dr. Rubin comes in. And to the Department of Energy's credit, and I think this was initiated during your time there, is that there are microgrid regulations coming in. There have been circulars that are put together in terms of putting a qualified third-party process, and I know there are guidelines that are making it more market-friendly. So we're eagerly awaiting the release of that so that we can help meet targets. And that's a policy signal. Attorney Alex is going down to the literally the micro level. And then we understand through the leadership of Senator Win Gatchalian, who was a microgrid bill. In fact, we're testifying tomorrow at the Senate, virtually, of course. We want to share that experience and to make it a level playing field. So it's a work in progress. The sooner the better, obviously, but we've got good policymakers and technocrats putting these refinements to the mother law, which is the Electric Power Industry Reform Act, and getting it so that the smaller players like us can have some confidence to put our funds in and know that it will be honored, and we can generate both a social return and at the same time a good return for our investors.
And I think in order to come full circle in this discussion, we need to bring in the issues on technology again. And I'd like to ask Dr. Huntong, what do we see in the timeline of technology development that will make us or assure us that these technologies will, in the long run, really become affordable? And also, how do we ensure that third world countries do not just become dumping grounds for old technologies that are no longer being used in other countries? I mean, we've seen that happen in other areas. So quite controversial, Dr. Huntong?
I think I'm more qualified to talk about the first item. Like I mentioned earlier, I think prices tied to solar storage, they are all dropping. And in terms of technology, they are actually AI-related technologies that can do very good forecasting, be it in terms of solar irradiance or even load forecasting. Some of these technologies are now very readily available and can be easily implemented for you to very easily or accurately optimize the whole microgrid operations, and for you to run it at very cost-effective means. So these are all very positive developments, whereby if there is a, I would say, economic viable way then definitely you should be able to achieve it, right? For your second question tied to whether I don't think I'm qualified to answer,
That's
but I
all
would
right.
just say that in most circumstances, at least speaking from experience, Singapore experience, there is always a gestation period, right? And for Singapore, I would also say that microgrids is still very much a piloting and demonstration stage, whereby it's actually costly for us to do some of these R&D or test bedding. Having said that, the government is committed in terms of building capabilities to better understand what are some of the things that we need to put in place, because one of the key things tied to test bedding is really policy, right? In Singapore, I think the considerations are different, but I will tell you that in Singapore, land is always a big issue. And my first project, the Pulau Ubin microgrid test bed, it was a huge amount of effort just trying to secure the land for the gas pipeline, for the electricity cable. I basically do rounds and rounds of agency consultation. The other big issue for microgrids will be actually fire safety tied to energy storage. In Singapore, like I mentioned, land is very limited, and there's always a high build-up area. So SCDF side, or our civil defense, which is in charge of fire safety in Singapore, they are tend to be more stringent compared to regulations from other countries. So some of these pilots and test beds are important for us to set guidelines. I believe Philippines will likely have to go through the same learning cycle and gestation period before the whole technology will ramp up in terms of adoption. Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Huntong. And just as a follow-up question also, how sustainable are these technologies in the face of natural disasters? I think this is a question from Clarence. Uh, Seeing as how Southeast Asia is a very vulnerable region to climate disasters, how sustainable are these green technologies?
I think globally, microgrids, or the key driver for microgrid is resilience. If you go through various literatures, be it in US, Hurricane Sandy, so on and so forth, I think the starting point for microgrids has always been disaster, or more from a defense military angle, whereby in times of disaster, do you have a backup power source that can quickly kick in? And I think that there are always critical infrastructure, be it hospital or transportation hub, that requires 24/7 power, and there's no compromise. So for some of these countries, the microgrid is the solution, and basically it gives you the additional resilience to tide over a natural disaster. And I would also say that at Experimental Power Grid Center, which I'm heading up now, we have designed microgrids with multi-layers of resilience, meaning that there can be, you can design your microgrid with multiple loops and multiple so-called failover scenarios that can actually improve your resilience more significantly compared to a typical microgrid. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. If I'm not mistaken, Quintin, you've had some run-ins with some storms already, or
Yeah,
typhoons?
yeah. It's just to build on Dr. Huntong's comment. In fact, just as a bit of trivia, before we actually launched the Sabang microgrid, a lot of the simulations were actually done with the experimental power grid in Singapore. So we were, because our headquarters is in Singapore, so we actually had to rely on best practices, right, and good and sound methodologies to be able to do this micro, because a lot of it is integration that leads to good resilience. That's the first part. Like, designing well is always going to be the first step. Now, the second part is in terms of the kind of technology you use. Even on our rooftops, for example, because we do solar PV rooftops. One of our universities up north in Tuguegarao, where Category 5 storms have been known to hit most recently, it survived around 6 storms already, and the unit is still there. I mean, it's a 220 kilowatt unit, not so big, but it powers the university effectively because we're using world class, mounting structures that are light and non-corrodable. You're able to keep them on for the 25 years that they're supposed to have a commercial life on. So again, it's a design thing. If we were to scrimp on materials so that we could save money or increase our margins, on the third and fifth year, it would show in a Category 5 storm area. So you would have to redesign it properly, procure it properly so that you have the best things that will last and protect that equipment for 25 years. And then that makes a difference. And then the third one I was going to mention, and to the credit of the regulators, is on the DOE side, if you have a service contract, you have to file a quarterly report. If with the Energy Regulatory Commission, you have to make sure that the price points that you have promised during the hearings will stay. Because if your technology is not up to scratch and you just did it to win a bid and eventually you bait and switch and the prices end up going up, like some players we know, what will happen is the ERC will call you out because your report and the complaints from the communities on the ground are going to reach them right away via Facebook of all places. So I think there's enough check and balance in terms of how well you design it, to how the regulators are doing oversight, to how climate change and the community will bear you out and keep you at your word for 25 years. And hopefully that's a good system that ensures accountability.
Truly, truly. And of course, we can't have a conversation on microgrids or any project in any industry for that matter without asking questions about finance. So maybe Attorney Alex, on the finance side, there is a question from Nikki. How can local banks support this? Or do local banks support this? Are our financial institutions actually, do they actually find this a sexy project enough for them to put their eggs on?
One of the trends that we have been seeing on the finance side, globally and not just in Asia or in the Philippines in particular, that is that a lot more banks have been including ESG indicators, environmental, social, and governance indicators into their profiles, both for assessing risk and also to kind of figure out where they want to put their money in and what projects they want to invest in. So because of these increase in ESG indicators and ESG activities within banks, there is certainly space to consider that a microgrid project is at par or fits into their ESG profiles, not only in environmental, because if we talk about microgrids, most of the time we talk about how they are renewable and how they fit environmental indicators because of the climate change aspect. But even the social indicator, remember that microgrids are being used to bring electricity, which is essential to the development of off-grid area. So it hits those two counts. Now, how can we make this happen or accelerate that more and more banks include microgrids into their ESG profiles? One important thing that we should be doing, at least here in the Philippines, is to really show clear indicators or benchmarks on how we are able to say that the microgrid project is good, or how we can say that a microgrid project is bankable. So the more information we are able to show banks on the viability and the success and the best practices, as mentioned by Quintin, of microgrid projects, the more they will be able to rate if an investment would be sound in these types of projects, and then the more that they can insert that into their ESG profile.
So I guess this is a challenge for Dr. Huntong on the technology side and for Quintin on the business development side to make sure that microgrid projects are sexy enough for investors to come in and for banks to finance. 1 hour is too short, definitely. But one last question, and we're going on overtime on this. Is there a downside to building microgrids? Dr. Huntong, maybe on the technology side, is there a downside to building microgrids?
I would say do your sums well, because the downside is that you will lose a lot of money if you don't do your calculations well.
I think yeah, that's right. It's basically it really boils down to that, and Kitin can very well attest to that, right, Kitin? What are
Yeah,
the
yeah,
downsides?
yeah.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, yeah, no, you really have to have a certain missionary mindset. I'm glad the principals of our firm, have had the development mindset experience, because otherwise, why don't you just put up a conventional power plant, or put your money in Bitcoin, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's about where your appetite for risk is. And as Dr. Huntong had correctly mentioned, if you don't have the kind of design capability to engineer a system that will last for 25 years, that will make the regulators happy, and at the same time will give you the price point that gives you, which is the three magic letters in the investment word, your internal rate of return. If you don't balance all these three, then you're right, you're going to lose your shirts, right? And you could have just invested in Ethereum or Bitcoin. Having said that, because you have a certain certain abiding empathy to what is happening on the ground, and believing in that global paradox of have empower the smaller player, then that really forces you to be creative in terms of saying, what hybrid technology, what integration will I need so I can get my returns, the community gets its proper rate, and the regulatory commission knows that we're charging exactly what we promised to charge. If you check off those trade-offs, you limit the downsides, and then finally, just on the comment on the backs, you build and they will come. So, we're grateful for the development bank of the Philippines to help with our first project finance. The commercial banks are following suit. And as you mentioned, Attorney Aina and Attorney Alex, it's about how they see the MVP, the minimum viable product, or how they see the first proof point, pay their loans off, grow their thing, keep their heads above water, even during a pandemic, which we've done, thankfully. And at the end of the day, that will allow more financial institutions to come, and then you have a multiplier effect. But again, somebody has to start somewhere, and we're happy to have that, have had that growth pain to share with you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kentin. And with that, it's been an hour of microgrid discussions here in Asia Society Org. But before that, before we go, I don't think, I think we still have time. So I'm the host. We go on overtime. Let me just ask for some parting words from our panel. Please, parting words that you can share with our viewers, your thoughts and your insights on this discussion. Maybe I can start with Alex.
Thank you, Attorney Aina. Again, I will just want to really highlight that most of the conversations we've been having on microgrids really centers on the fact that it is a renewable energy. You would have renewable energy technology necessarily in your microgrid, and then it would contribute to being a climate change solution. But I think oftentimes we forget the social part of it, where microgrids is also really a solution to allowing for inclusive development for so many parts of the world, not just Asia, not just in the Philippines. We need to remember that, as mentioned earlier, electricity is a basic need. And especially we see that in COVID-19, where we have all shifted to an internet-based workplace, or even just conducting your social gatherings within the internet. Electricity is crucial. And until we figure out how to get electricity that is cheap and that is reliable to these areas that are off-grid, only then can we truly say that our development is inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Attorney Alex Gamboa. May your passion for your advocacy be as infectious as COVID-19. Dr. Huntong?
Yeah, I think my sense is technology is ready, and really it's the objective that you have in mind. Whether there's a price point, you want to have certain level of resilience, so on and so forth. So you need to you can design a microgrid to meet the various objectives that you have in mind, and I would say that it is also important to go with someone that has experience. I think having done, I would say, one of the very first microgrids in Singapore, I thought that was a huge learning experience for me. And I'm quite sure it's the same situation in Philippines. So go with someone experienced like We Energy, for example, yeah, because that helps. Because really, the experience in terms of negotiating all the various regulatory related approvals, I think that is something very important, and that would actually significantly cut down the amount of time, effort, and also energy to get the project up and running. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Dr. Ngin Huntong, may your tribe increase so that these technologies will really get to benefit all of mankind. And of course,
Thanks,
Kintia.
Ina.
Yeah, thank you, Attorney. Excellent moderating, and again for joining the Age Society. Thank you very much for curating and hosting this robust dialogue, Attorney Alex and Dr. Huntong. Thanks for being a great panel. I mean, I'll just weave it together by and one of my mentors used to say that the best way from a speaker's lips to an audience's heart is through a story. So I'll end with a story. We're at an inflection point where we can really make microgrids grow. Technology is growing, policy is growing, but at the end of the day, it's a social impact, as it was previously mentioned. Manang Helen Hiray is a fish vendor in Busuanga, and she, by the way, has a bio with a iPad that basically showed us and my boss, our CEO, when we went there, that she had an Excel sheet in terms of how much money she was making already by trading fish, and she was making money that she probably could have, she could afford a car more than we could, but there weren't any roads in that area, in the island. So at the end of it, you could tell how much potential is. She was saying that if we had the electricity at 1/3 of what it is right now, which is 50 to 55 pesos, and you just bring it down to a half to a third, which technology now allows you to do, and the policy allows you to do, she can double, triple her income. And because she could put up a cold storage facility that can save her goods and can have value-added fish, fish and seafood without being at the mercy of the trawlers and the poachers and the traders, right? So you multiply Manang Helen across the archipelagos, like 20,000 islands across Southeast Asia. You can see the economic potential, the multiplier effect. That's what excites us, notwithstanding the risk. And thankfully, with an ecosystem like with Parabukas, NTU, Singapore Power Grid, ERC, DNR, DOE, if there's a collaboration and a cohesion in terms of making the sector work, we really will transform this region for good. So with that, I want to say thank you very much for allowing us to share our story.
Thank you very much, Quintin, also for sharing with us this evening. And so there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. 1 hour certainly is not enough to have this conversation on microgrids. We've asked some of the questions, but definitely there are more to come. So watch out for more conversations on microgrids here on Asia Society Org. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.